The sea beat itself to gray foam against the shingle, and above it the cliffs of Hardhome stood like rotten teeth, black with old fire and gull droppings. A wind came down from the frozen bays and through the ruined palisade. It moved like a hand through the ash and the fishbones, shook the ribs of wrecked huts, worried at the ragged strips of skin flensed from some long-dead whale and forgotten on hooks. It carried sounds, too, the crack of axes, the creak of ropes, the laboring grunt of folk who feared to be last to a boat, and under it all the vast, indifferent breathing of the sea. Jon Snow stood with his gloved hand wrapped around the pommel of Longclaw and watched men and women who had fought him and hated him take up bundles, lift children, and move in a shamble towards the surf. "Never thought I'd see you hurt us like deer, Crow," Tormund said at his side, beard stiff with frost. The big man wore a tattered red cloak, and his laugh was a dry bark made to hide 1,000 losses. "Ho there! Mind the rocks, you goats. You keel a boat on the beach. I'll use your skull for a chamber pot." Jon drew breath through his scarf, icy on his lips. In the distance, a longboat slid off its rollers and hit the water with a crack that echoed off the cliff. Then the men at the oars dug deep and the boat began to move. Eastwatch by the sea lay southward. Some would make it there before dusk. The rest would camp by the boats under the cliffs until morning tide. They were not enough boats. They were not enough of anything. Dolorous Ed had his hood thrown back so that his face could savor the misery of the wind. "If the gods meant us to row across the shivering sea with a mountain on every back, they might have given us more backs," he said to no one in particular. His humor had sharpened in these last days, as if he feared what silence might bring. "It's the eyes I don't like. They look at you like you're their last sausage and they mean to split it 6 ways. Tormund snorted. "He's no sausage. He's the Lord Commander. Mind your mouth around crows, Ed of House Miseries." Jon felt the name like a weight at the shoulders. Lord Commander. He had said he would do the thing everyone hated, and now he did it and everyone hated him for it. The promise he had made, to bring the free folk through the gate and south, to save them from what came behind them, had been so simple when it was words spoken in a hall lit by torches. Here, the simplicity had been muddied by hunger and old blood and cold, by the way a mother would clutch a child and bare her teeth at a stranger who reached too close. Still, progress came. He had Tormund, and he had the strength of purpose that followed after Maester Aemon's eyes went milky and then still. If any prayer could carry on a wind, it would be the one Aemon had whispered to Jon between fever and sleep. "Kill the boy and let the man be born. Protect them all." A woman with a scar down her left cheek and an axe on her back came to stand in their shadow, her breath plume-white. She had eyes like chipped flint and a jaw made for stubbornness. Karsi, she had called herself, when she had spat and said she would listen. "My folk are gathered by the jetty," she said. "The mothers and the boys. There's not enough of your boats for the old men, seeing as the water will eat them quicker than the cold." "We'll come back for them," Jon said. He had said the same to 20 men already, and each had looked at him like a liar because hope spoken aloud was often a false thing. Karsi's eyes were hard, but they softened when she glanced towards the cluster of huts by the timbered quay. "You'll come back if there's a sea to come back across," she said. Then, more quietly, "You feel it too?" He felt it strongly enough that Longclaw seemed to hum where his hand rested. The smell of the air was wrong. The cries of the gulls rode the wind less often. The dogs had gone silent, nothing but low keening in their throats. The cold wasn't simply cold. It was attentive. It pressed on the lines of the palisade and the spaces between ribs like a predator testing a pen, patient. He had seen it gather before. He had seen the shapes that moved inside it like pale kings gliding over ice. "We keep loading the boats," Jon said, and heard how calm his voice was, as if he could not imagine any world but this one where orders were given and men obeyed them. That calm was borrowed from some deeper place. If he turned and looked, he might see that there was nothing there, only a tired boy with the wrong father's face. Tormund clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to set the furs to creaking. "Aye, Crow. We keep loading, and when the dead come..." "When they come," Jon said, "we meet them at the palisade. Ed, get the barrels of pitch up on the wall walks. Karsi, you take the south gate. Tormund, you're with me at the north. 1-1. The giant lumbered out from the lee of a broken warehouse with 2 masts under his arms. As if they were kindling, he meant to break across a knee. He spoke, the low thunder of his voice muddied in human ears. Tormund translated with a grin. He says, 1-1 is tired of bones that won't stay down. So are we all, giant. So are we all. They moved then, because men will suffer doubt but cannot bear stillness when they smell their death. The wall of stakes and driftwood that ringed the landward side of Hardhome creaked beneath feet and the weight of pitch barrels and the press of bodies seeking to peer into the white-gray beyond. Jon took his place on the broadest portion of the palisade. Longclaw out and naked, black ripples in the steel like the surface of a night river. He breathed. He listened to the cold. The first sign was the birds. They rose from the black pines above the cliffs in a ragged rush and went wheeling out to sea as if the forest had coughed them. Then the outermost haze thickened. It became not fog but a substance, a colorless thing with motion. And the world beyond it strangled down to a handful of shapes. He saw men on the wall lean closer, as if they could peer their way through. He reached a hand out and checked one with a pressure on the shoulder, gentle but firm. Behind him, somewhere in the tangle of huts, a child began to cry and was hushed with a voice that shook. "They come," Tormund said under his breath, as if he did not wish the cold to hear him. The first whites arrived in a clatter of bone and limb, running. They hit the palisade like surf, dozens of them, pale hands and black fingers, the mouths that were not mouths gnashing. Pitch poured down and caught on hair and old rags. Fire whooshing up, the air sharpening with the smell of burnt marrow. The men at Jon's back shouted. Arrows hissed. Spears were thrust between stakes and came back sticky, snapped. The first ladder hit, then a second and a third, lashed from driftwood and sinew and the ribs of their neighbors. Climbing forms slithered upward, the fire eating at their legs without sound. Jon moved without thinking, the black sword biting, a head lopping, a wrist shearing, the thing below him falling with its fingers still holding the rung. Tormund roared, axe chopping, the blade wedging through a skull and sticking, and he kicked the body free and yanked the axe loose with a curse. Ed lit another rag bundle and threw it, his stoop making him look like an old woman at a hearth, and a corner of the wall above the gate became a lick of dull orange in a world gone white and gray. Carsey shouted from the southern run. Jon only heard the word boys, and then he was moving like a man who had been already running for 100 years. He reached the turn of the palisade and saw that a portion of the southern fence had leaned, its rotten timbers losing their battle with the frozen ground. 3 whites had wedged themselves in the gap and were scrabbling through in a tangle of limbs. The first made it to its feet just as Carsey reached it. She chopped once, twice, and the thing came apart like wet kindling. A second stretched long fingers towards a boy peering from behind her. Jon's sword flashed, the arm came free and flopped like a fish, and the hand crawled still until a boot crushed it under heel. Jon smelled pitch and dogs, and a sourness at the back of the throat that he knew was fear rising off living men. "Back," he said to Carsey, and she turned and barked commands he did not need to understand. Mothers gathered the boys and moved them in a knot towards the water, the boys looking back with their jaws clenched to keep from crying. One had a bit of knotted string around his wrist with a tin fish on it. Jon found himself watching the charm as if it had meaning, and then he told himself a story in his head. A stupid little story of how the boy would keep it through the voyage and show it to some ranger's wife in Eastwatch, who would laugh at it and press bread into the boy's hands. He clung to it as men cling to small ropes. The white deepened, and then the others came. You did not hear them. You sensed the sudden quiet as if the world held breath. They appeared beyond the last of the fires in a line on the snow, each as tall as a lord and lit from within with a pale blue the color of glacier light. They had the cruel long swords that did not breathe. They did not shout. They only watched, arranged themselves, and began to walk towards the palisade with the softened grace of kings. "There," Tormund said beside him, hoarse not with fear but with rage and something like awe, "there's your high-born guests." Jon felt cold kiss the inside of his mouth when he breathed. He stepped down off the wall walk and moved along the packed earth toward the north gate with a speed that was not a run and not a walk. bodies turned to watch him pass. Men parted, cancers of fear opening in the press and healing again behind him. And he found that his hand had closed around Longclaw's hilt so tightly, his knuckles had gone white inside his glove. The first of the others reached the gate and stepped into the gap they had opened with dead bodies and flame. The mist around him swallowed pitchfire, drank it, and the black wood of the gate began to frost over wherever the cold kissed it. Jon went forward alone to meet him. "Stay," he said to Tormund without looking back. "Hold the line." "That's rich," Ed muttered. But he did not move, and that was the important part. The other came on without hurry. Snow whirled around him as if eager to be near. There was no visible breath, because breath is the sign of a thing that lives, and this was something different. He raised his sword and it sang, high and sweet, and the sound went down Jon's spine like a fingernail. Jon raised Longclaw in answer and stepped sideways, heel sliding in a patch of frozen mud. The other moved in, as quick as a hawk, and for a moment there was only the ringing of steel that was not steel, the shock of it up the arm to the shoulder, the cold that made tears leak unbidden out of the corners of his eyes. He let the first strike glance off and turned the second. He went forward in the same motion and cut across the other's ribs where a living man would gasp. The black steel bit. The pale thing reeled and made a sound that was like ice cracking. Then, in a motion delicate as a dancer's, it struck at Jon's thigh and forced him back. He slipped in the slop near the gate, righted himself, and went low, driving the point of Longclaw at the other's belly. The blade kissed that hard, glassy flesh and slid in a hand's breadth. White frost exploded outward in a gust. The other's eyes flared. Then it shattered with a sound like the breaking of a winter pond when boys jump up and down on it to make their sisters scream. The pieces lay and steamed, then melted into nothing at all. The whites that had been pressing at that point of the palisade went down like a feast of spiders that someone had set fire to. The press lessine. And arrows found targets where before they had only made bundles of twigs quiver. Men cried out, some in triumph, some in terror that issued from the same place. Jon took a breath that burned his chest and looked up. There were more of the others in the snow beyond, and they did not step back. They stood where they were, poised, watching him with a perfect stillness that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle beneath the damp of sweat. The cold sharpened. It came not from the line before him but from above, and Jon lifted his head as gulls blew out from the cliffs like foam. The sky had grown hard and clear as a blade. It was from that sky that they heard the sound. It was a sound like a horn blown by the world. It did not arrive so much as it arrived everywhere at once. A long, rolling note with the heat of a summer storm inside it. The hairs on Jon's arms and neck stood up. Men on the wall shrank, then craned their necks to see. Ed's mouth fell open. Tormund bent his head and swore in a voice small as a prayer. Carsey's axe hand tightened until the knuckles went bone pale. The sound came again, closer, and the air pressed down as if the sky had chosen to stoop. Then something cut the sunlight like a swath of green glass. The thing moved with a speed that made men's eyes tear. It coiled as if the sky were water, and this was a fish that had never known anything but that element. Came with a smell like hot stone after rain, like lightning, like old stories. Its wings threw vast shadows across the palisade and the crowd and the throng of the dead. The wind of those wings staggered men and snatched hats away, set flags to snapping. The creature bent in a smooth curve and came on a line for the north gate. 7, Ed said hoarsely. 7 save us, that's a dragon, Tormund whispered, almost reverently. A real one. It was green, a deep strong color like moss in a river. The long neck ridged with plates of iron dark horn, the eyes hot gold. Its chest swelled, and what came from its mouth was not the orange yellow of hearths but a light white gold. So bright that the snow blue ahead of the palisade looked briefly like dusk at high summer. Fire touched cold. The first rank of whites and then the second and third went away in a rushing roar, ash and wind and something that screamed with voices that had never been human. The flame raked side to side, and the entire left flank of the dead army became a moving wall of black air. The others stood like statues, the light washing over their glassy armor, and they turned as one to look at the thing that had blazed out of the sky like a falling star. Jon did not remember deciding to move. He was simply moving, out through the open gate and into the clearing heat of that fireline. Men shouted after him, but they sounded far away. He strode over ash that was already crusting with frost at the edges. The dragon banked and came back around with a beat of wings that threw Jon's hair in his eyes. It dropped lower, so low that its shadow swallowed him, and then it turned its head and looked at him. The golden eyes were ringed with something like soot and something like smoke. They were bright and deep and alive. The dragon saw him. More than that, it recognized something in him, and whatever that was moved back through both of them like a memory. Jon stopped where he was. The dragon came lower still, so he could see the scales along the underside of its jaw and the little scars there, the places where metal had scraped. It hissed softly, and the sound was different from the roar it had loosed at the dead. It was almost curious. Rhaegal, Jon heard himself say. The name came to him as if someone had put it in his mouth. A green dragon named for a dead prince. A name his own blood had in it, all unknowing. The dragon's pupils blew wide for a heartbeat, as if something had startled it. It struck the ground with a sound like an avalanche stopping and folding itself into stillness. Its talons chewed trenches in the frozen earth. Steam rose from the places where its breath had melted the topmost layer of snow. It lowered its head until the long snout could have touched Jon's chest. He did not move. He could feel heat through his furs on his face, a prickling heat that made his eyes water. He reached up and put a glove on one of the plates just above the joint of the jaw. The plate was hard and worn smooth. Beneath it, something immense was alive and aware. A hum went through him. It was not sound. It was as if a string that had been strung from him to the world since he was born, slack and unnoticed, had been plucked. He felt something like falling and something like waking. The dragon exhaled, a rolling gust that pushed his hair back, and then it huffed and made a chuffing sound like a horse that knows its rider and wants to be about the business. The others did not wait politely. They moved. They came toward him with their tall spears at a loping glide, and behind them the whites pressed again like a gray tide reforming. Jon took his hand from Rhaegal's jaw and made an impossible decision in the space between breaths. He put his boot to a spur of horn and heaved himself up, finding purchase the way a boy does when he climbs a tree for apples and does not think of falling. The dragon's scales were not smooth but patterned, and they bit through the leather of his gloves just enough to give grip. He hauled himself along the curve of the neck, the world swinging dizzyingly beneath. He reached the base of the wings where the neck met the massive shoulders, and there he pressed himself as close as he could to bone that felt like the root of a mountain. "Jon!" someone shouted. A voice he thought might be Ed's or Tormund's, but the wind took it. The others came on. Rhaegal spread his wings. The membrane caught the light and went a lighter green like unfurling leaves in a sudden spring. The dragon pushed down once, twice, and the world dropped. Ed away. On a horse, you feel the animal under you like a tremor. On a dragon, you felt the whole world. The air under them was a river. It pressed on his face and sheared at his eyes until tears ran unbidden. His stomach tried to stay with the ground and had to be dragged skyward with the rest of him. Then it found its place, and what he felt then was not the fear of falling but the terrible joy of not falling. The palisade reduced to a ring of porcupine quills. The whites became gray ants that burned where lines of gold white swept over them. The others were bright pin splinters in the snow that shied and slid to keep distance. Rhaegal turned his head slightly, as if to feel the weight on his back. Jon leaned in and pressed his hand to the thick ridge at the dragon's neck. "There," he said, though there was no sense in words, only the thrust of his will and a blind trust that the thing beneath him would understand the angle of his shoulders and the turn of his head and the intention that lived somewhere behind his sternum. He wanted to cut across the front of the others, to set fire between them and the whites, to break the line and turn their advance into a flounder. The dragon understood. He banked into a curve that made Jon's blood shift in his ears like poured wine. The wind roared past, and then the mouth opened, and light came out. The white gold torrent hit the snow in a line that ran like a drawn sword across the face of the world. The snow boiled, went to water and steam and then glass in an instant that shattered a heartbeat later with a sound like thunder. Whites fell by the hundreds, their run reduced to ash drifting upward in a thermal. The others slid sideways, seeking the gaps, but Rhaegal bent his head, the breath changing its tilt as a gull changes its wing to ride a different layer of wind, and the fire cut them off again. One of the tall pale figures caught the edge of that light and went down onto one knee. Steam burst up in a fount. It drove its spear into the ground, and frost spidered outward from the point through the scorching in a whorled pattern. The other rose, steaming like a man from a bath, and lifted its face. Jon saw the leader then, not because of any crown, he wore none, but because the air bent around him more than around the others, as if a deeper cold lived at his heart. He stood on a slight rise beyond the reach of the fire, and as Jon watched he turned his head to follow the dragon's path with that lazy, patient curiosity Jon had seen once in a winter wolf watching snow fall on its own muzzle. He lifted one hand. A spear of ice was in it. In the instant before the spear moved, Jon's body knew something his mind had not yet said in words. He leaned forward hard along the line of Rhaegal's spine and put his tongue to his teeth so that he would taste blood and remember what it was. The spear went by like a screaming white fish. It was so fast that Jon might not have seen it at all if the world had not gone slow under some terror. Rhaegal twisted in flight, body coiling. The spear grazed the inside edge of his right wing. The membrane tore with a sound like ripping sail. The dragon roared, a raw, ugly thing compared to his triumphant earlier calls. Jon felt the spasm go through the muscled wing and into the ribs beneath him. He clung. Rhaegal beat his wings again, uneven now but still terrible strong, and climbed with a grudging fury. "Not today," Jon said aloud, to the spear thrower far below, and to the cold, and to the part of himself that wanted to become a boy again and hide in the shadow of a father he did not truly know. Rhaegal leveled out, turned his head slightly as if to look for what his rider would ask. "Take me there," Jon said. He meant the line where the others thinned near the rocks. He meant the place where a man on a dragon might get close enough to leap and a sword tip might find something worth cutting. Rhaegal folded his dark, torn wing a fraction more and lost height in a way that was a glide and a threat. The world came up at them. Ash and snow and pale figures weaving among their own ruined ranks. At the last moment before they hit, Rhaegal backwinged so violently that Jon's teeth clapped together. He slid down that living slope of muscle and scale and jumped. He hit hard, rolled, felt something in his left shoulder grind and then catch. He came up with Longclaw in both hands and nearly stumbled into the legs of another with a spear already driven to kill him. His left shoulder screamed. He turned through the pain and brought the black blade up. It rang off the other's spear, slid, bit deep into the arm above the wrist. The pale flesh split like ice. Frost leaped from the wound. The hand still clutched the spear even as it lost connection to the rest of the arm. Jon pivoted and took the thing's head. It blew out into powder and light, and the whites around it sagged as if their bones had been unstrung. He had no chance to breathe. Another of the tall figures came, sword like blue glass, and Jon met it. His shoulder hurt. His breath burned in his chest. His eyes streamed from the cold and the wind and the heat, and none of it mattered. He had a sword that remembered old fires. He was the only black thing in a world bleaching itself to white, and the dragon's shadow fell and lifted across him like tide. He stepped in under the other's guard, brought the blade down in a half circle, and watched the pale thing burst as if it had been only a winter dream too long-lived. Edges of the dead army went thin. There were breaks in their press now, places where living men might move out through and find doing, not only surviving. He felt rather than saw Tormund at his left, roaring, the axe chewing into a ribcage with a sound like a butcher's table. He heard Carsey shouting where the mothers had made a human chain to pull a boat out through the chop. He saw Ed set a white alight with a torch and kick it back into three others, who went up like tinder-dry brush. He looked up. The leader, the one who had thrown the spear, had moved down off his little rise. He did not hurry. He came with the slow inevitability of a glacier grinding a valley into its shape. Rhaegal cut in low, breath pouring, and the dragonfire washed over that pale form. It rolled around him, went around the pillar of cold the way wind goes around a stone tower. The dragonfire did not touch him. Jon saw that with a clarity that left him more cold than the wind could make him. So that was the truth of it. Fire burned the dead men, and dragonfire burned them by the thousand. But the one at the center of all that cold was something different, and fire would not unmake it. A different price would have to be paid there. "Come on, then," Jon whispered to it, though his mouth was so numb with cold that the words were probably only husks. He lifted Longclaw and steadied the hurt in his shoulder with a breath. The other, the Night King, though no man had given him that name here, tilted his head as if to consider the invitation. Rhaegal screamed and came at the other again. The leader of the dead lifted another spear, and Jon didn't think. He ran. Perhaps the dragon understood that, because as the spear left the Night King's hand, Rhaegal banked and took it in the ribs where the plates were thickest instead of in the heart or the neck. The spear sank halfway and shivered. Rhaegal's roar shook snow from the cliff in a powdery sheet. He beat his wings and went up, awkward and wrathful. The Night King turned his calm face toward Jon at last, and in that cold regard Jon felt the weight of something that had watched the world crumble and freeze and thaw and never been moved by any of it. He closed the distance with the last of his strength and swung Longclaw at the thing's neck. It met him. The blue glass sword and the black steel kissed. The sound was like everything in the world breaking at once. The shock of it numbed Jon's fingers to the bone. He told them to hold anyway, and they did, because this was where he had chosen to die if die he must. He turned, brought the sword up and then down, and met the other again. The cold inside his mouth was a pain now. His shoulder was fire. His lungs sawed. He thought of Winterfell's yard, and the sound of Robb's wooden sword on his, and the way his father had stood with hands behind his back and watched with a face that was not unkind and not proud and had nonetheless contained both. The wind changed, or something did. Rhaegal came down on the Night King's right, his injured wing half-furled, teeth snapping. The thing stepped aside with that fluid, hateful grace. But in stepping, he gave Jon a line. Jon did not try anything clever. He drove the point at the place where a man's right collarbone meets his neck. The black steel struck and skittered and then slid along a ridge of that strange cold armor, a hair's breadth away from a target he could not see. The Night King's free hand came up and closed like winter on Jon's wrist. It felt like stabbing yourself with a handful of icicles. Jon snarled, showed his teeth, and shoved with everything that was left in him. He did not wound the Night King, but he made him move. The leader of the dead stepped back to keep his balance, and in doing so he trod onto a patch of ground that Rhaegal had just melted and which had not yet refrozen to black glass. His heel sank a fraction. He glanced down with expressionless contempt, then up again. By then Jon had already pulled free, staggered, recovered, and swung Longclaw at the nearest of the other Pale Walkers who had moved to flank. He killed that one. The whites that had been surging at his back went down like grain under scythe. To his left, Tormund bayed laughter and grief and smashed ribs. To his right, Ed cursed colorfully and dropped a flaming brand and drew a knife to finish a thing that had not yet learned it was dead. Beyond them, at the palisade, Carsey had a boy under each arm and was making for the boats with her jaw set. The Night King looked at Jon for a long heartbeat that stretched and stretched until it seemed to reach back into the time before either of them had been born. Then he lowered his sword and lifted his arms out from his sides slowly, as if he were a priest calling a congregation to prayer. Jon felt horror then. Not of the Night King, not of death or cold or fire, but of what he knew was about to happen. "No," he said, but the word had no power here. All around them the bodies, enemy and friend both, all those who had fallen, stirred. The dead woman with the braid that Carsey had cut down to save her own children twitched and sat up with her mouth full of frozen blood. The wildling man who had thrown Jon a spear earlier and grinned despite the fear in him lifted blind eyes and grasped for anything living. The whites came up like seeds after rain. Rhaegal screamed again, a sound dipped in fury. He came low and raked fire across the newly risen. They went down again, burning, the snow around them seething. The Night King lowered his arms without disappointment or triumph. He simply stood. Jon knew three things all at once. The first was that dragonfire would not undo that particular thing with arms lifted. It could only thin its consequences. The second was that the walkers, these bright princes of winter, were too few to drown that fire in ice unless they came into it, and he could hurt them if they did. The third was that none of that would matter if they stayed here inland under the weight of that cold. Hardhome was a ruin, and ruins make graves. South! Jon shouted, and his voice came out lost and torn and somehow still loud. Back to the boats. Fall back to the boats. Ed set the inner steadings alight. Tormund, with me. Carsey. Get them into the water. They made a fighting retreat because there was no other kind if you meant to live. Fire licked at huts and ran up a mast left leaning on a rack. It gave them some cover, and in its shadow men ran with bundles and children and blood on their boots. One ripped a portion of the palisade entirely out of the ground and used it as a club, smashing whites into clumps of mud and bone. He bellowed something that sounded like his own name, as if it were a spell to hold him together. The dead pushed. The living fell back. Rhaegal strafed again and again, breathing. His wounded wing canted and stiff. Each pass made a path where no dead could stand and the living could stream through, and the smell was of meat and brine and iron and the strange sweetness of pitch fire. At the waterline, the surf clawed at the shingle with a greedy white hand. A longboat shoved off with a cry as a dozen hands on each side pushed it. It hit the water and lurched and almost capsized and then righted, and the rowers pulled like madmen. A second boat slid in. Carsey ran and threw one boy in, then another, then shoved a mother in after them with such force that the woman swore at her through tears and then took up an oar with ferocity. A third boat lurched as a white clambered over the gunwale. Tormund took its head in a great hewing blow that sent the skull skipping like a stone across the water, and then he was laughing because that was a thing men do when they see something absurd and terrible in the same breath. Jon found himself standing knee-deep in the surf, cold biting through wool and leather and into bone, cutting down whatever came near the small space his body could defend. A boy with a tin fish charm climbed into the boat and almost fell backwards. Carsey's hand steadied him and then shoved him along, and he fell across the knees of some stranger and clutched the gunwale with white fingers. The boat began to move. Jon turned and cut down a girl missing half her face who had once been a fisherman's wife, and all the world narrowed to the arc of his sword and the bodies pressing and the hands reaching and the sound of the oars striking rhythm. A shadow fell. Rhaegal came down so low that his chest almost kissed the water. He opened his mouth, but no fire came. He had done too much of it in too short a space. He snarled frustration and snapped at a knot of whites, catching three and flinging them into the surf where they went under like stones. Jon took the opportunity. He grabbed the carved prow of a retreating boat and hauled himself half into it, then turned and reached a hand for Carsey. She shoved two more children past him and then leaped herself, landing in a tangle of limbs and swears. Tormund waited. His beard hung with ice, and a dozen hands pulled him in. One came last, because he was one and because the shore could not stand him. He waded out, the water climbing his legs, and when whites clung all up his body like lice, he simply stepped deeper until they either washed free or went under with him, and then his head and shoulders rose beyond the line of boats like a moving island. The Night King watched from the shingle with his bright eyes. He did not pursue because the sea does not belong to him, not yet. He stood and let the cold pour out of him and took in the picture of men making distance. Then, slowly, he reached down and drew a fingertip through the half-frozen mud where some giant foot had scooped a trench, and when he lifted that finger and looked at it, Jon felt that a mark had been made in the world somewhere, a point kept for later. Rhaegal flew along the line of boats like a shepherd dog along a flock, snapping any dead thing that walked into the water and tried to climb aboard, beating his injured wing in a heavy, grim rhythm. Jon knelt tangled in oars, in bodies, his chest heaving. He looked back at what had been Hardhome and saw it going to smoke in the morning light, the smoke freezing in the cold and falling as soot that blacked the white. He could not say whether what he felt was victory or only survival. He could not tell the difference now, and perhaps there wasn't one. 7 bloody hells, Ed said beside him. His hood rhymed with salt. If I'd known dragons were going to be involved, I would have put on my nice cloak. Carsey snorted, pulled her axe free from where it had wedged under a bench, and rested it across her knees. She looked at Jon with a kind of dare in her eyes. "You ride that thing like you were born with his tail in your hand," she said. "Is that what crows learn in their little black nest? To ride monsters like a tale told round a winter fire?" Jon found that he was laughing, and the sound came out raw and shocked and full of water. He shook his head. "No," he said, "that's not what we learn." He looked up at where the green dragon, snorting steam, kept pace with the boats, and felt again that plucked string hum in his chest. "But perhaps it's what the world needs us to learn now." Tormund shook himself like a soaked dog, spray flying. "You'll be eating like a king among my folk, Crow. We'll tell this story in halls with light and smoke." He glanced up at the dragon. "We'll tell it quiet, too, so as not to wake your pet." "He's not," Jon began, and then he stopped. He had been about to say, "He's not mine." That was true as far as it went. The dragon did not belong to him, nor did he belong to the dragon. But between them something belonged nowhere else. The boats moved through the chop and toward the south. As they made distance, the air shifted. The cold did not leave, but it loosened. Men began to talk in low voices. Some wept openly, some as if they were coughing. A woman with gray hair tied in a loop around her head pulled a blanket over Carsey's shoulders without asking. Carsey grunted thanks and then did the same for the woman when her hands began to shake too hard for knots. Ed gave his cloak to a boy and took back the tin fish charm to tie it on properly. 1-1, a dark lump moving through the water beyond the last boat, grunted occasionally in satisfaction as a dead thing clinging to him finally let go and sank. Jon looked at his hands. They were raw and nicked under the torn gloves. Where the Night King had gripped him above the wrist, there was a purpled ring of skin that looked frostbitten. He flexed the fingers. They answered. He looked at Longclaw. The black ripples in the steel were clean. He could see his own face dimly in it, pale and wind-burned, hair stuck to his forehead with salt and sweat. He thought of his father, and then, without wanting to, of another father, the one whose name he had never dared put to himself. He thought of the name that had come into his mouth on the shore like it had always lived there. Rhaegal. The dragon circled, dropped, and then, with a care that made the men in the boat stare like fools, set his hind legs down in the water on either side of their stern and made a place for himself there. His tail trailed a furrow in the sea. His head came down to Jon's level and the big eyes watched him. Jon reached out and touched him again, close to the nostril where the skin was a little softer between plates. The dragon blew a breath that fogged everything and then made a huffing sound very like a weary horse. "How far to the wall?" Carsey asked, staring not at the dragon but at the horizon as if it were a cliff she meant to climb by sheer will. "Half a day on a true wind," Ed said. "Harder if the gods fancy watching us suffer." He peered up at the sky. "Oh, they fancy it. We'll make Eastwatch by dusk," Jon said. "The current favors us here, and the wind, it will rise." He had no cause to know that. He only knew it the way he sometimes knew a thing on a battlefield, as if someone had whispered into his ear in a voice he trusted because it sounded like his own. The wind did rise, crooked as a beggar's back but strong. The fleet of clumsy, overloaded boats moved down the coast with a stuttering grace. Men at the oars found rhythm and were shamed enough by Rhaegal's huge, steady presence to keep it, even when their arms burned and their shoulders begged for rest. On the longboat where Jon knelt, the boy with the tin fish charm fell asleep with his head against a stranger's knee and snored softly between chattering teeth. Carsey sat with her axe across her lap and her eyes half closed, not sleeping, only banking a fire. Tormund told a story about a goat that had stolen a jarl's beard, and the men around him laughed because they needed it, even though a goat could not do such a thing. Ed stared at the wake and muttered to the water, perhaps a prayer to a god of small chances. By the time Eastwatch's squat towers swam out of the winter haze, Jon felt a bone-deep ache in every limb and something like gratitude in the hollow of his chest where cold had tried to take up residence. Men shouted on the towers. Signal horns were blown with clumsy urgency. The gates to the little harbor began to open, the ice-crusted chains groaning. Jon stood and nearly fell and would have, If Rhaegal hadn't put his snout against Jon's hip and bracketed him for a moment with the casual certainty of a mountain holding up a sky, the boats slid into the cramped harbor. On the quay, black cloaks moved. A familiar figure separated from the others with a soldier's economy of motion and came to the edge to await them. Alliser Thorne's face, when the lantern light took it, was a mask of contempt held rigid by discipline. His eyes flicked to the dragon and back to Jon as if the latter were the worst obscenity. "You've brought us a menagerie, Lord Commander," Thorne called, voice neither welcoming nor unwelcoming. A blade slipped between ribs. "I suppose you mean to stable that creature in the common room." "He'll stable himself if he cares to," Jon called back as the bow of the boat bumped the quay. His voice came out steadier than it felt. "See your men help the children first, Ser Alliser." Thorne's mouth tightened. He did not move himself, but he clipped orders sharp as frost and men went to their work. Carsey lifted a sleeping boy and passed him to waiting hands without ceremony. Tormund hauled a net of bundles and baskets into a heap that looked like it might avalanche and bury a cookhouse. Ed clambered out with a stiffness that made him wince, and then immediately turned to catch the next child with a gentleness that belied every bitter thing he'd ever said. Samwell was there, too, round face red from the cold and eyes worried and bright. He made a sound when he saw Rhaegal that was half squeak and half laugh. "Jon," he said, and then softer, "Jon, you what?" "There was no time to knock and ask if he might like a rider," Jon said. "He came to us. Once that would have been a story." "It still is," Sam said fervently. "And stories have power, they do. Sometimes more than swords." He reached out without thinking and then thought again and aborted the gesture, hand hovering in indecision. Rhaegal turned his great head and eyed the hand with a look that was not unkind. Sam's hand trembled. He laughed at himself, embarrassed and happy. "7 save me," he said. "7 save us all." In the hours that followed, life asserted itself with a ferocity that was almost rude. The cold helped, it keeps action brisk, keeps men honest. Fires were lit in braziers in the yard, and in the halls, stew pots were filled with whatever Eastwatch's meager stores could yield. Wounds were seen to, blankets were counted and rationed with more sense than sentiment. Thorne glared, but he did it from doorways that had been opened when Jon commanded it and which he did not close when Jon passed by. Rhaegal stood in the yard with his belly rising and falling luxuriously, steam coming from his nostrils. Men made a wide path around him without being told and then found reasons to pass through it anyway, to see the way light ran along scales, to make themselves small and yet enlarged by the telling. In the Lord Commander's chamber overlooking the yard, Jon stripped off gloves with clumsy fingers and held his hands to the brazier. They stung and then ached deep. He looked down. In the yard below, Rhaegal lifted his head. Their eyes met. The plucked string hummed in Jon's chest again. Then it quieted, satisfied. Sam hovered like an anxious bird. "I read about this," he said, words coming fast because his excitement outran his breath. "Well, not this exactly, but about the old days. The first nights when dragons fought against the cold, when they say the sky bled light. If you believe the old books, which most sensible men don't, except you must because..." He gestured helplessly at the yard and the dragon, and Jon felt a smile twitch at the corner of his mouth despite weariness. "But there was something else, too. Dragonglass, Jon. Dragonstone. I found it in the oldest account Maester Aemon trusted. If the queen, the one across the sea, if she still holds Dragonstone, if, well, they say that black glass kills them," Jon said softly. "I've seen it." He remembered the feeling of the obsidian spear in his hand, the way the other had come apart under it. "And Valyrian steel." Sam nodded eagerly. "Yes, and if it should be that we have a dragon," he swallowed. "And a rider. The old tales always say the glass is a thing of the volcano's heart, a fire made still. If we have both living fire and the dead fire fixed in stone, then we have more than a story. We have a way to make a story into law." Jon rubbed at the purpled ring around his wrist. It ached in that odd deep way bad cold leaves behind. He understood that he was thinking more slowly than usual from exhaustion. Even so, His mind went to the thing that had stood and raised the dead, as if asking a question of the world and hearing only the answer it already knew. Dragonfire had done nothing to it but make steam. "Fire for the dead," he said. "Steel and glass for the ones that lead them." He looked at Sam. "We will need more glass than half a dozen old spearheads." "We will need dragonstone," Sam said. He hesitated. Then, as if there were a cliff in his mind and he was about to step off it. "And John, Maester Eamon wanted me to go to her when he was dying. He said the prince that was promised would come, perhaps not a prince, but, well, he wanted to go to her himself, even that old and worn. If we go to Dragonstone, or even send word to her." He swallowed. "The world is getting very small, John, and so is the time in it. What would you have me do?" John asked, not as a test but because he wanted to hear it. "Send a raven," Sam said at once, then, more bravely, "Send me too, or let me go south with Gilly and the babe to Old Town, where I might read things the world forgot it knew. You'll need a maester who believes what his own eyes show him." He gestured again, inarticulate, as if the dragon below overwhelmed him anew. "We don't get to choose if the stories are real. We only choose if we look away." John went to the window. The air that slid in was knife-cold, but it cleared his head. Rhaegal was awake again below, turning his long neck to snap a chunk of frozen meat from the carcass a handful of brave souls had dragged into his reach. The dragon chewed with a satisfaction that was somehow comical. Men laughed. The sound rose and fell, human and thin and altogether unconquered. "I'll send a raven," John said finally, "to Dragonstone, to anyone who might carry a letter onward, to a queen of nothing and everything across the sea." The idea felt like a stone in his hand, heavy, real, a thing he might throw and start a ripple he could not predict the end of. "We'll ask for dragonglass and for help. We may get one before the other." Sam's smile was small and luminous. "Sometimes one is enough to make the second likely," he said. "I think that's a thing a maester once wrote." "Was he any good?" John said. "No," Sam admitted, "but he meant well." They smiled, shadows of themselves, tired and raw in their ease with one another. John's shoulder had gone from fire to a dull throb. If he slept, he would dream of cold, of light, of falling and not falling. If he did not sleep, he would be useless to anyone tomorrow. He stood a moment longer at the window and listened to the sounds of Eastwatch. Men cursing at knots, a child crying and being soothed, a cook banging a lid, the low, contented rumble of a dragon at dinner. He thought of the Night King drawing his finger through mud, making a line. He wondered what that line meant and suspected it was not a promise but a measure. "Not here," it seemed to say. "Not yet, but soon. You have not broken me, only the first of my hands." He closed the shutters and turned to the brazier. Firelight set Longclaw's ripples moving like a river. He slept. Dawn bit at the eastern edge of the world with small, hard teeth. The weather held cruel, crystalline, clear. News went down the wall and up again on quick feet. By noon, Castle Black had it entire and was rearranging itself around the idea of a dragon in the yard at Eastwatch. The Black brothers are practical folk. They plan as they mock. Thorn sharpened petty arguments like knives and then carefully put them away for some later use, because the cold truth of a dragon had cut him, too, and he bled pragmatism. Knights of the Watch with more pride than sense made shows of indifference when passing through the yard, and afterward told each other, quietly, that they had felt heat on their faces and it had been like a hearth on the worst night of a northern winter. The free folk ate and slept and woke to help set nets and lift stones as if they had been born to the place, because work is a way to refuse despair. Carsey walked the length of Eastwatch's sea wall 3 times each day with her axe over her shoulder and a boy at either hand, listening to the sea like a new language. Tormund set about insinuating himself into every kitchen and bed he could find with an enthusiasm matched only by the cook's refusal and the women's wary curiosity. Ed drafted lists of supplies in a hand so crabbed that it made John's eyes ache. Sam collected and cataloged every last piece of obsidian they'd left in caches along the haunted forest and squinted over them as if he could make more with his stare. John wrote. He wrote on good parchment and on bad, on scraps, on margins, on things meant for other letters that had never been sent. He wrote to lords who would laugh and to queens who might not exist. He wrote to a woman his dead maester had wanted to see with his living eyes, and who held a castle that sat upon a mountain of the only stone that kills winter's nobles by right. He wrote to her with care and with honesty and with something like humility. He sealed the letters with Black Brothers seals and with a pressed coin and with a twist of thread. He gave them to birds and watched the birds struggle up into a blank blue sky that made their black shapes look faded. He practiced with Longclaw until his left shoulder stopped complaining. He spent hours in the yard with Rhaegal, who descended from wherever dragons go when they have no roof often enough to make it routine and not a miracle. The dragon learned Jon's scent and his step and the pitch of his voice. Jon learned where to put his hands on the ridge of the neck just so. He learned that when he leaned his weight to the right, Rhaegal would angle that way without being told. He learned how to stay on when the dragon climbed like a thrown spear. He brought Rhaegal hunks of meat. Rhaegal sometimes took them from his hand and sometimes ignored them because he was full and Jon needed to learn patience. He learned something else too, something he could not have put into any letter, that when he sat with his back against warm green skin and his eyes closed, the world arranged itself inside him with a rightness that was not peace but something hungrier. He knew he had been waiting for this without knowing he waited. It was not all training and letters. 2 days after Hardhome, a band of whites came out of the haunted forest and hit the foot of the road to Eastwatch like tide hitting stone. Jon was in the yard. He heard the cries and was moving before the sound resolved to words. He came down into the lower bailey with long strides, Ed at his shoulder, Tormund trotting, Carsey in their wake. Men ran along the road toward the sound, spears and torches bobbing, breath making ghosts of them. The whites were many but not as many as at Hardhome. They had been sent to test, to harry. Rhaegal came with Jon's shout, and no one had to be brave enough to ask a god for fire that day. Another night, the wind died and the temperature fell too far. Men's beards froze to their coats. Jon walked the wall walk with Ed, cursing quietly at the windless cold and listening to the frost creak in the mortar. "If they want to come again," Ed said, "I hope they do it when the wind's up. I like to feel the misery carry the smell of itself away." "Even misery gets tired here," Jon said. He looked north. The night was too clear. The stars looked heavy enough to fall. Somewhere out there, a line in the ground had frozen into stone and would wait under snow until a boot found it again. The raven from Dragonstone came when the sea was a plate of dull steel and the sky had gone to low wool. Its beak was crusted with ice when the maester's apprentice took it from the coop and carried it, half-dazed, to Jon's hands. The seal was green wax stamped with a three-headed dragon. Jon broke it with his thumb and read. He read again. He turned the letter and read the backside as if it might have changed while he was looking away. She wrote with assurance. She wrote as a queen with an empty throne but a very full idea of herself. Her hand was firm and fine and hard to read. She used words like winter and war without flinching. She said this, that Dragonstone was hers by right and that he was welcome to come and take what he needed from what lay under it provided he came himself and bowed his head as a man does when he asks another for help. She said this more politely than that and with more grace, but the shape of it was the same. She said, too, that a green dragon breaking winter in the far north had set tongues wagging in her halls, and that the name he had spoken to the dragon when he called it down, relayed to her by some ear in some mouth, had lodged in her mind like a splinter. She said she would like to see the man who had given that name voice. Jon folded the letter along its crease and stood looking at nothing for a long moment. He could feel Sam's eyes on him, wide and eager and anxious. He could feel Ed's on him too, dry as a dead leaf. He could feel Tormund's as a weight that wanted to push him toward adventure. He could feel Alistair Thorne's cold dislike from 3 rooms away the way a man can feel a draft through stone. "Dragonstone," he said finally. Sam made a noise that might have been a suppressed cheer. "She has it then?" "It seems she does," Jon said. He did not say also that she had a pride like a blade and that perhaps that blade might be a good tool or a thing you cut yourself on. "If we go, we'll go at speed. At Eastwatch cannot be empty, nor Castle Black. I leave men I trust and I leave you to count supplies twice when you have time to count them once." Tormund, if you come as an ally under truce. If you stay, you keep your folk working and the peace with my brothers, or you'll answer to me." Tormund grunted, approval hidden in gruffness. "I'll answer to you either way, Crow, but I wouldn't miss the chance to see what a dragon queen looks like. I expect she's all teeth and tits." "Gods, Tormund," Ed said, and then, because it was Ed, he added, "We should be so lucky." Sam was beaming. He sobered a little. "What will you do about the other thing? The way you named him?" Jon shook his head. "I'll do what I have to do. I'll bring back glass and fire. She asks me to bend. I'll bend as far as I can without breaking my oath." He touched the purple mark on his wrist through the sleeve, as if it were a talisman. "But I won't quibble over pride while winter walks. Not any longer." Alistair Thorne hated the plan and did not pretend otherwise. He called it folly and betrayal and vanity in 3 different speeches to 3 different audiences, and each time he watched Jon carefully to see if the words bit. Jon let them. Hurt is a kind of proof. Then he turned and went to the yard where Rhaegal waited with slow patience visible in the way his tail thumped occasionally on the trampled snow. "Dragonstone," Jon said to the dragon, and felt the hum inside him change key. It was nothing like agreement. Dragons do not agree. They act. But the dragon lowered himself for Jon and did not bare his teeth. He went into the air with an ease that made the wound in his wing seem a memory and not a present thing. Jon strapped a small chest behind the ridge of the neck. Inside were letters and a strip of dragonglass with Sam's handscript on a piece of paper tied to it. "This is what kills them. Show her." They left Eastwatch with a slap of wings and a rain of snow from the guttering. The men below looked up and shaded their eyes and pointed. Children squealed. Carsey lifted a hand without looking at the sky and returned to teaching a boy how to tie a loop in a net when his fingers were too stiff. Ed stood very still and raised his face, as if trying to decide whether to bless or curse his friend and master. In the end, he did neither. He simply watched until the shape of the dragon dimmed against cloud and then went inside to count the barrels of salt pork again. Wind lays lanes over water. Rhaegal followed them without knowing they were there, and because he had made them the moment he rose into the air and everything under him changed shape. They went south along the wall because Jon wanted the reassurance of that old cold behind him. Like an old stone house you keep in sight as you walk away from it into a storm. When Eastwatch was a smudge and the wall a white line, they banked eastward with the taste of salt rising under them. Rhaegal's great wing beats became a steady clatter on the bones of the wind. Jon felt the rhythm in his ribs and matched his breathing to it, and after a time he stopped thinking of the wind as something that could cut him and began to think of it as something that could carry. They slept on a promontory of black rock above a sea that moved full and slow like a great animal breathing in sleep. Rhaegal tucked his head under a wing in a way that made him look, for the first time since Jon had known him, vulnerable. Jon sat with his back to warm scale and looked out at the water until his eyes would not focus. Then he slept sitting up and dreamed of Winterfell's godswood, of the way the leaves in summer made light like bottles hung in a window, green and warm. When he woke, the dragon was already awake and staring at the space where dawn would be when it came. They went on. They followed the finger of an archipelago southward, fishing boats veering out of their way with terror and then swinging to follow at a cautious distance because terror is quickly married to curiosity, and men are men even when the world changes shape. They crossed a white squall that froze the outside inch of water in Jon's beard and left a crust of glitter in the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. They came out of it into a sky like a fresh-made blade. They saw, far to the west, the humped outline of Skagos like the back of some great beast. Rhaegal roared when a cloud shadow took him by surprise and then seemed to be embarrassed by the impulse, if a dragon can be embarrassed. Jon patted his neck and felt foolish for the attempt to comfort a thing that feared so little. When at last Dragonstone rose out of the sea, dark and spired, older than memory, its volcano a bald head under snow and smoke, Jon felt the plucked string hum again, hard enough to make his teeth ache. Rhaegal made a sound he had not made before, a deep throat growl that was neither warning nor welcome but something that might have been recognition. They landed not in the yard where once Targaryens had kept their beasts but on the black beach where waves chewed at old glass turned green and blue by the sea. Men on the headland above ran in two different directions at once, as men do when panic and duty tug different hands. The dragon settled his hindquarters and looked at the castle like a dog regarding a house it had known as a pup and returned to as a monster. Jon slid down and landed on sand that had eaten fire and was fed by it still. He knelt and put his hand to it, feeling a warmth that could be rock and old sun and old sin. He stood when he saw them coming. There were many, dressed in a dozen colors and cuts. Men with spears and men with tall bills and men in armor that did not look entirely practical because, Jon supposed, it was meant for speaking to the eye more than to the sword. At their head came a man who walked with his hands tucked behind him like a maester, and who had a face that might have been handsome if it had not been so busy. Beside him walked a woman with hair so white it was almost silver and eyes like night when all the stars are out. She wore gray like the inside of a cloud and moved like someone who had taught herself grace because it was armor, too. Jon had never seen a queen. This one did not wear a crown. She did not need to. They stopped a small space away. The woman's eyes went at once to Rhaegal and then to Jon. As if he were a piece of a puzzle she had not expected to find in the box. The man beside her let his eyes sit on Jon's clothes, his sword, his boots, his weathered hands. He noticed everything. He looked as if noticing was the only pleasure left in the world to him. "Jon Snow," the queen said. Her voice had sand in it, and sun, and the memory of scream. And G in it, and the memory of singing, too. "Your letters were..." Her mouth tilted in what might once have been a smile. "Instructive." "Your Grace," Jon said and bent his head. He did not bend his knee. It would have been too much to ask of it, and he had not come to flatter but to bargain. "Thank you for receiving me. You brought me a dragon," the man beside her said cheerfully. "That does make a very strong first impression." "I suspect he thinks he brought me," Jon said. The queen's eyes lifted to Rhaegal again. Something like pain moved through her face, very quickly, there and gone, like seeing a child you had lost as he would have been if he had not been lost. "He will not be ridden with a bit," she said. "If he lets you sit where you are, it is because he wishes it, not because you mastered him." "I know," Jon said simply. He lifted the chest down from where he had strapped it. "Your Grace, may I show you a thing?" She nodded once. He opened the chest, took out the knotted papers and the dragonglass blade. He held it out to her, hilt first. She did not reach her hand. The man beside her did, and then, when he realized what it was, he gave a low whistle. "Obsidian," he said. "Not the most practical of weapons to my mind, unless one wishes his blade to break at an inconvenient moment. But handsome. It kills them," Jon said. He did not put weight on the words. He did not need to. The scar around his wrist seemed to pulse. "Not the dead they burn. Not the leader who is something else. But the others. The ones he brings to command. Dragonglass kills them. So does Valyrian steel. The rest is a winter storm. But you do not fight a storm. You endure it. You fight the men who ride it." "You have seen them?" the queen asked. She had not yet looked away from his face to the glass in the man's hand. "I have killed them," Jon said. He did not boast. He reported. "At the fist and beyond the fist, once with obsidian, and at Hardhome with this." He touched the black sword at his hip. "Your Grace, I did not come for your banners or your fealty. I came for what lies under your feet and is yours by right, and for your dragon's fire to burn what fire is meant to burn." "You put it too neatly," the man said, but there was something like approval in his voice. "I am Tyrion Lannister, for my sins. This is..." "I know who you are," Jon said, more sharply than he intended. He closed his eyes a moment. When he opened them he said, "My pardons, Lord Tyrion. I have read what the realm writes about you when it thinks it is telling the truth. Seldom does. But one old man I trusted once told me you could be relied upon where the world asked for sense." Tyrion blinked, and then he laughed, short and real and startled. "God save me. I shall embroider that on a pillow." He turned the obsidian in his hands, and his eyes lost their mischief and went intent. "What do you want of us now besides the glass?" "Nothing I do not also offer," Jon said. I will not bend my knee and then crawl. I will weapon you with truth and do the same to my own pride. I ask to mine Dragonstone. I ask for your fires in the north if I send for them when the dead march in force. Not on a raid, not a harry, but a war. I will give you what I have instead, truth and the chance to do the one thing kings and queens are meant for. Protecting. Daenerys Targaryen, the name arrived in his mind as the smell of smoke does, inevitable and everywhere, watched him. I was born to make a choice that would burn cities, she said, almost to herself. Now the world asks me to build a wall made of summer. She took the dragonglass blade from Tyrion at last, held it up, watched gray light move along it like smoke. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh and might have been pain. Dragonstone is yours to mine, Lord Snow. Take as much as 1,000 men can carry, and then come back with 2,000 more. Teach my smiths to shape it as your men know how to do. This is not a thing for pride. He bowed his head again. Thank you, your grace. And when you call for fire? She asked. When you call for my children? He looked back over his shoulder at where Rhaegal stood and at the wound in the wing that had already begun to knit itself into a new pattern. He thought of Hardhome, of men rising, of fire making steam around a winter king who did not mind. He thought of the line drawn in mud. When I call, he said, I will already be burning. They did it then because there was no more time to talk. Men who had only just learned to say dragonglass without laughing learned to say obsidian, as if it were a prayer and the unmaking of life at once. Pit mouths were opened like wounds in the flank of the mountain. Tunnels were dug. Carts were filled. Tools broke and were mended and broke again. The smell of the mountain's old heart came up raw and bright. Jon went down into the pits with Sam's notes and a miner's impatience. He came up with black glass in his hands and a feeling like gratitude to a thing that had no reason to be grateful back. Daenerys came down once and watched the work in silence, and then came up and went to stand on a windy headland with her hair whipping and her eyes not blinking because queens must learn not to blink when the world looks back. Tyrion made numbers out of everything and put them into columns and found ways to make them bigger when men were unwilling to add. Rhaegal ranged the island and slept touching a stone that was warm to the touch even at midnight. He let Daenerys come near him once. She did not put her hand out to him. She only stood and let their breaths meet in the cold air as smoke and steam. He made a soft noise then, as if a memory had flown by his head and brushed his ear. Daenerys' eyes did something small and private. My brother, she said, loved songs about Rhaegar and hated the man. I suppose that is the fate of princes. Jon did not answer that. He could not yet answer that. Nly spent more hours with Rhaegal and felt the line between his life and the dragon's life become a bridge you could stand on without thinking and only notice when you looked down at the water. He did not intend to be gone long. He could not be. The Night King did not wait, and though the cold's hand had drawn back from Hardhome licking burned fingers, its arm was long and the knuckles didn't swell or stiffen. When the first carts were filled, when the first forms had been made, when the first arrowheads had cooled and lay black and tight in their wrappings, he made ready to go. Daenerys came to the beach to watch them load. Your letter said you broke the dead's first invasion, she said, not quite a question. He had not lied in that letter. He had not boasted either. He had only been careful with the truth the way you are when you carry a lighted brand into a stable full of old straw. You know that a thing that breaks becomes sharper along the break. I do, Jon said. It was a poet's thought. It had not occurred to him, but he felt the rightness of it. He will come again. He will, she said. He will come again to the place he did not like to be made to move. He will find you there on your feet, and he will think it an insult, and still you will have to win. Do you intend to? Yes, Jon said simply. It would have been nothing but a boy's green courage if he had not also felt the dragon behind his shoulder, breathing, lending him the steadiness of that breath. He did not add that winning would not mean living. It might not. He was finished with counting his own life at a higher value than any others in the sums he made. Aemon's last breath had taught him that. Tyrion offered his hand with a small flourish. Jon took it. If you live, the Lannister said wryly. You will find that our queen is an infuriating ally. I imagine I'm no pleasure myself, Jon said. Oh, you'll be insufferable, certainly. Tyrion agreed, and his grin was real. Go then. Bring back stories I can turn into counsel. They went. Rhaegal took the air with a spring that needed no run. The wind smelled different in the south, sweeter, rotten with life, full of spice and smoke and the stink of men who thought the world was theirs. Jon felt the difference like a taste of unfamiliar fruit and then put it aside. They cut the miles between Dragonstone and the wall down to a line he could count, to a width you could measure on a map with your fingertip and be wrong about. They reached Eastwatch faster than they had left it. It was good they had. Camps had bloomed like frost flowers north of the wall, where the first of the wildlings had made rude steadings to wait for friends and kin to be brought through. They were not farms. They were a holding of breath. The first night after Jon's return with carts full of obsidian, the forest shuddered with a sound like the cracking of every tree at once and the blunt, awful chorus of dead throats howling hunger. The Night King did not intend to probe again. He intended to come. They arrayed themselves as best they could in a world that would not give them more time. Men with dragonglass-tipped arrows stood on the walk with faces like cut wood. They had not practiced enough, but they had hands and eyes and will. The gates bristled with new spearheads that shattered light rather than reflecting it. One stood with a bundle of lances on one shoulder like a hedgehog made giant and made ready to throw them as a man throws knitting needles. Carsey's boys, not boys anymore, stood at a brazier and passed torches down a line with solemn care. Ed counted and cursed and counted, and when he had finished counting, he let Jon put a hand on his shoulder and say nothing. Thorne polished his sword with a rag and watched Jon mount Rhaegal with the expression of a man grinding his teeth to powder, so they would not bite anyone but his own heart. The Night King came out of the white with princes to either side. He came at a walk and then at a glide and then at a glide that was almost a dance. He did not favor the sea this time. He favored the land, where their fires were fewest and his breath was longest. He came with 1,000 dead at his back. The wall held. It had been built for this. But a wall is not a sword. It is only as good as the men upon it and the weight of what it stands upon. If a storm were content to stare, no house would ever fall. Storms press. The dead pressed. The trampled snow went to black ice under them from the weight of so many feet. The black ice broke here and there and made slick traps that caught the living too. Arrows hissed and shattered. Some broke on bone. Some found the thin number of pale princes and turned them to powder. Where they fell, the dead behind them fell also, whole ranks going slack at once, and men shouted encouragement without hearing their own voices over the roar. Rhaegal went along the line like a torch hung from a moving spar. He breathed and did not stop until his breath made him wheeze, and Jon felt panic in his guts that the dragon would not breathe in time to breathe out again. He did. He lifted and banked and descended when Jon leaned his body. The two of them, a bent bow and an arrow flying over the heads of old stories made new. The Night King tried his spear. He threw once, and a dragonglass-dipped bolt coming out of the dark took his arm at the elbow. And for the first time since Hardhome, the Winter Prince took a step not of his choosing. He looked up, and if the cold had been a face, it would have gone sharper. It did not break all at once. Battles do not. They fray and pull loose, and then one end turns into a rope in someone's hands, and that rope is used to pull a thing down. Jon saw the fray become a fall. He saw one take 4 the others with lances thrown like javelins in a field where once boys had thrown sticks at rabbits. He saw Ed's arrows go exactly where he put them back. As he had counted too many things in his life to miscount distance. He saw Carsey's boys pass torches with a rhythm that was like a dance taught by a stern mother, and the dead burn in lines where those torches touched. He saw Alliser Thorne cut down a thing that had been a brother of the watch the day before yesterday and do it cleanly, and then step aside and let a wildling woman finish it with fire because pride was a luxury he had finally put away. And he saw then, at last, the Night King. Saw him truly. Not as a shape framed in mist, but as a man might be seen in a hall when he comes to take a seat at a high table uninvited, and everyone must decide at once if he will be given a place or a sword. He stood on a hummock of frozen ground with his pale court fallen all around him. his bright blue eyes looking up not at the wall and not at the men on it and not at fire but at Rhaegal and the black-clad rider upon his neck. He reached down into the snow and drew up nothing. He lifted the hand that had been severed and found it whole again because winter forgives itself its bad jokes. He spread his arms slowly once more as he had at Hardhome. This time fewer rose. Jon saw it. He felt it. The dead rose, yes, they always would, endlessly, until the thing that called them stopped calling, but fewer and slower, and with a hitch in their movements, as if someone had tied a string to each of their wrists and let a child hold on to the other end. Rhaegal's breath had cooked the topsoil of the battle. The ground itself had gone to a fused glass in places. The new dead could not get purchased there, and others slid and fell and broke. The dragonglass lances had made holes in the winter's body where the cold would not flow cleanly. The Night King looked left and right and saw these things. Something like offense moved across that expressionless face. Then he turned, very slightly, and the tide which had been coming only forward went sideways, too. The dead tried to flow around the places where they burned and could not rise, around the dragonglass's black dead patches. They tried to go up a line of rocks to the right of the main press. Jon knew the line intimately. He had trained there the day before with Ed. He leaned and put his hand on Rhaegal and felt the understanding snap taut between him like a rein pulled. They went there. They went there fast enough that the world below blurred and the crows that had been too stupid to get out of the way spun like leaves in their wake. The rocks rose in a black seam out of snow, and there the dead were crowding, climbing over each other as they always must because they do not mind breaking themselves to make a wall for their brothers. Jon brought Rhaegal low and breathed there, and then, before he could think, leaned farther and felt the dragon's muscles bunch under him and knew he had chosen something he would only understand after it was done. They did not breathe again. They landed. On a dragon, the earth is always a suggestion. When your feet meet it again, it feels like an insult. Jon took it anyway because men do not get to choose the terms of their courage, only if they will bring it at all. He slid down Rhaegal's shoulder and landed on the black glass of a rock with his boots slipping and his knee barking. He gained his feet and ran the last yards to the place where the dead were making a living ladder. He took the topmost in the mouth with long claw and used the weight of the blade to lever it back into its brothers below. He found a pale prince not yet struck and rolled his shoulder and put the black steel into the place at the throat where the frosted armor did not quite meet, and felt the blade drink a winter that had not been meant to be spilled. The prince burst. The dead on that line fell limp and slid and made a tumbling cascade that took 100 more. Rhaegal came onto the line with his head, only his head, and snapped twice, 3 times, shook, tossed a clump of dead as a wolf tosses a rabbit to make the bones break before it eats. He breathed once more because he could not, and the breath went sideways when Jon's body said no, there, and he took the line of rocks and fused them to a ribbon of glass you could skate on but not climb. The Night King did not stay to see that work. He had moved back, 5 paces, perhaps a few more, and he stood still as winter's first thought. Jon felt something inside him want to rush there again, to repeat the ground dance they had done at Hardhome, to throw himself at that cold and see if the black steel could be persuaded to bite it. He did not. He could not. He was not a boy anymore. He had a dragon and men and something like a plan, and the Night King did not deserve the dignity of his own choosing. He went to Rhaegal's shoulder and put his hand to the scale there and hauled himself up again with the awkward grace of a man who had done this many times and still found it impossible. He settled where he knew to settle. He breathed. He leaned. They went up. The ground fell away. The wall rose, ancient and implacable, at his left. The line of the battle became a pattern, light and dark, moving and not moving, life and undash. He made a line with his body. Rhaegal followed. They burned the right places and left the right places to frost so that the dead could not stand and could not rise and could not move forward without slipping. The pale princes fell where the black glass met them in arrowhead and spear point. The Night King retreated, not fleeing, not beating the air with his cold arms, but stepping back with that same grave calm as if he were giving up a point in a game he had never intended to win that day. He did not raise his arms again. He did not move them at all until he stood in a place where the cold lay thick as wool. Then he watched. It took the better part of a day and then another to turn that push into a stumble and that stumble into a retreat and that retreat into a defeat. now fell. It blew sideways. It stung eyes and put out torches and hid edges. Men slipped and caught themselves, cursed and laughed because they were still talking. Dragons sleep between breaths, sometimes. Rhaegal napped aloft in the 5 minutes Jon took to drink water handed up on a hook from the wall walk. The dead broke against a plan that was nothing but the picking of 1,000 right small places to stand and breathe and fire and die. When it ended, it did not end with a cry. It ended with a lessening. Men realized they were not striking anything living, not even anything that had once lived not long ago. They realized they were looking at a field of smashed bone and fused black glass and melted snow gone to dirty ice. They realized they did not hear the dead anymore, only their hearts and the hiss of the wind. Someone laughed. Someone sobbed. Someone said a thing about sausages. Ed wiped his eyes with a filthy sleeve and declared that if he had to string another dragonglass arrow, he'd rather be a septa. Carsey leaned her forehead against a spear and did nothing else for a full minute, as if she were trying to decide whether the world existed when she was not moving in it. One sat down with a thump that made a little earthquake and began to pull flattened steel from his feet, as if he were plucking daisies from a meadow and found each funny. The Night King, who had been there, and then less there, and then not there as a particular presence but only as a feeling in the cold, was nowhere to be seen. Jon brought Rhaegal to earth on the same hummock where the Winter Prince had drawn his first line and slid down the same impossible shoulder. He went and stood where the cold had once been a wall you could lean on. He put his heel on the place in the mud where some finger had once drawn, and sometimes the world obliges a man and gives him a sign he can understand. The line was gone, melted and frozen and trampled and gone. He looked north. The white was only cloud and snow and the breath of a world that had not yet decided what to do with itself. He put the point of Long Claw into the ground and leaned on it and let his head hang between his shoulders. He stayed that way long enough that Ed came to stand beside him and said, in a voice that had almost no irony left in it, "Well then, you did that." "We did," Jon said. "Never liked we," Ed muttered. "Always comes before have to do it again." He looked up at Rhaegal, who had folded himself into a satisfying shape and was breathing like a forge. "That one's very fine when he's burning things, isn't he?" "He's very fine when he is," Jon said, and his mouth quirked. He could not help it. The plucked string inside his chest was humming again, this time in a note that sounded like relief and dread and purpose. "He's very fine when he isn't. He's very fine," Ed grunted. "We'll need 3 times the glass and 10 times the men and a god with a taste for good sense," he said. "But we're not dead today, and I suppose that's the sort of thing that makes bards lie." "They won't need to lie much," Jon said. "No," Ed agreed, and this time his laugh was clean. "That's the trouble." The tales went at once. That is what tales do, when men are hungry for proof that the world is not only cruel but also occasionally fine. In the far north, they said the crow who rode green fire had made winter step aside like a servant at a lord's table. In the far south, they said a dragon had flown from Dragonstone to the frozen edge of the world at the command of a queen whose hair upset sensible men, and the frozen edge had melted under his breath and gone weeping back to the sea. At Eastwatch, they said Ed's arrows could find the eye-hole of any corpse helmet at 200 paces, and Ed shook his head and said something about miracles and stands of trees and offered to show anyone proof if they brought a bottle. At Dragonstone, they said the mountain groaned happily when the pits were open to the light, and that if you lay your cheek to it, it would tell you secrets. And servants did, because servants know better than lords that sometimes the world will tell you a thing if you are gentle enough with it. Jon did not care and cared very much. He taught men to shape glass until their hands bled through the wrappings. He flew Rhaegal along the line of the wall so often that the ravens stopped noticing him and the men on the walk began to look less as if they were falling over when he went by. He sent letters to Dragonstone asking for more picks and more cartwheels and more men who were willing to call themselves brave and then be made to prove it. He slept in odd snatches and woke with the taste of cold at the back of his throat and the smell of hot stone in his hair. He went to the yard and put his hands on green scale and thought that if the world could be made new once, it could be made again, if only a handful of men refused the old shape of it. On a night when the stars burned steady and close and the red in the north was only a tremor and not a roar, He went up to the top of the wall and stood with long claw planted and the wind snapping his cloak behind him like a banner he had not earned. He looked out, past the dead wood and the black ice, past the first rises of the world's back. Rhaegal perched on the parapet 3 towers down, a dark shape that reared and settled, setting snow down from the stone in little waterfall scuds. The dragon lifted his head and breathed out, and the wind caught the smoke of it and made it a streamer, and the stars looked like a bride price on the world's brow. "You've a right to stand," a voice said from the stair. Thorn. He had come up quietly, for a man in armor. "You earned that." Jon did not turn. "I stand because I can fly," he said. "It's not a right, it's a loan." Thorn came to stand 2 steps to Jon's left, properly, as if he remembered something of a drill yard. "I don't like you," he said without but I like not dying more." He nodded toward where the dragon was, which was odd, because men who had not found it in them to like dragons looked at them the way men look at storms, out of the corner of their eyes. "You did a thing there that I couldn't. That's a sentence I do not enjoy forming." "We do what we can," Jon said. He glanced aside. "Thank you." Thorn made a dismissive gesture sharp as frost. "We'll do it again," he said. "Everything that's wrong with you still offends me. But if you ask, I'll hold that right flank. I expect you'll need it held." "We will," Jon said, and was not ashamed of how the words reached past his pride to something like gratitude. He lifted his head and looked north again. He could not see the Night King. He had never been able to, not when the man, if man he had once been, did not want seeing. But he felt the colds well up there, a pressure and a patience. The line in the mud had gone away because 1,000 boots had trod it. The hand that had drawn it had not forgotten. Rhaegal made a sound that was not a roar. It was small for a dragon, and if anyone else had been there, they might not have heard it over the skirl of the wind. Jon heard it. He put his palm flat on the ice-slick stone at the top of the wall and felt, through it, the hum of something older, something that had been sleeping in the bones of the world since before men called winter winter or fire fire. He thought, not in words but in that plucked string sensation, that perhaps the wall itself had been waiting for this green fire to sit on it, that perhaps a song could think it was finished and find a new verse waiting. He did not think of kingship. He did not think of secrets sown into him by his mother's last breath and his father's ruin. He did not think of bending knees or breaking them. He thought of fire and glass and the cold that did not like to be made to step aside. He thought of boys with tin fish charms and women with axe hands and men who counted and cursed and threw lances as if they were knitting needles. He thought of a man with a face like a still lake drawing a line in mud because he did not like to be told no. "Come then," Jon Snow said, "to the wind, to the dark, to the absence that was presence, to the world itself. Come and try again." Rhaegal answered with a sound like summer. The wind took it and broke it and made it into knives because that is what winds do here. But some of it went north without breaking. Some of it went north like a promise given back with interest. And for the first time since Hardhome, the night did not feel like a door closing. It felt like a breath drawn in before words.